cost. Next bill under consideration is House Bill 1310. Madam Secretary.
Engrossed House Bill 1310, a bill for an act to create and enact a new section to Chapter 62 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to the creation of a pilot program to allow the carrying of a concealed firearm on school property by qualified individuals, to amend and reenact subsection 2 of Section 62 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to an exception to the prohibition against possessing a firearm at a public gathering, to provide for a report to the legislative management, and to provide an expiration date.
Senator D. Larson.
Mr. President, House Bill 1310 is all about local control. The bill doesn't mandate anything, and it only allows a limited number of schools to choose to participate in this 2-year pilot. The bill in Section 1 allows an armed first responder in a school with the approval of that school board. The superintendent can accept only up to 10 schools to participate and will adopt rules and develop the criteria that must be followed along with an evaluation process for the pilot program. Subsection 1 requires the superintendent to adopt rules and an evaluation process. Subsection 2 requires approval of the school board or governing body before a school can participate. Once a school is accepted into the program, the school must submit a plan to the superintendent of public instruction specifying how they will implement the program and participate with the superintendent in emergency operations assessment and include identifying crisis and emergency threats. Subsection 3 requires the individual selected to complete comprehensive training. Subsection 4, in addition to the above, discusses who may qualify to be the first responder and that they must be approved by the school board or governing board and possess a valid Class 1 concealed weapons license from North Dakota. Subsection 5 requires continued training annually for recertification for skills and specifies that the responder must have the weapon concealed and under their direct control at all times. The school board at any time can withdraw their permission for the first responder to carry in the school and to participate in that pilot project. The remaining subsections reaffirm the above and give more detail, and the final part of the bill adds these individuals to be exempt from the people that are able to exempt from the prohibition to carry a weapon at a public gathering under this criteria. Mr. President, our larger towns have school resource officers to respond in case of a school shooter attack. Our smaller communities do not have these officers in their schools, but some are so remote that it could take half hour or more to even respond to a school shooter attack. This bill would allow a limited number of schools to provide protections for their own children. There are no mandates. This is just enabling legislation. Perhaps no school will choose to participate, and that's okay, but your committee thinks that we should provide the option to those schools. On a 5-1 vote, the Judiciary Committee voted do pass and asked the Senate to concur.
Senator Holmberg.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, I draw your attention in this bill to line 16 on page 1, which is what sent a chill down my back when I read it. You're in a small community. You're going to run for school board. You have a public forum. And of course the question will come up, will you allow us to have guns in our school? And you will have a nice debate about that. Unfortunately, those kind of debates are what people focus on. We should be talking about the education of students, not getting into a scrum over whether or not this candidate or that candidate is going to allow guns in the school. I think we're adding an element to school board elections that we might regret. So I would hope you'd vote no.
Senator Nelson.
Mr. President, earlier this month a survey was done of 850 folks here in North Dakota. Of those people, 80% of those people voted in the last election. And of those people, over 68% of them said, no, we don't want guns in schools. But we do think that you should look at some other options, and those aren't mentioned here. Perhaps you could apply for a school safety improvement grant to remodel and refigure your school to make them physically safer. Or perhaps you could apply for a school safety improvement grant to fund highly trained school resource officers that your school could request. And funding and commitment to hire more school counselors and social work who are trained to recognize signs of distress that might be inclined, of those who might be inclined to exhibit some violence. And perhaps we could look at some funding and commitment to making substantial and necessary investments in mental health services. I think these would be of far greater use than this particular bill, and I would ask you to vote no.
Senator D. Larson.
Mr. President, our schools are already training teachers and other personnel, janitors, cooks, people to be aware of what some of the warning signs are for someone who is upset and may perhaps have been bullied and maybe would think about becoming a school shooter. They're doing that. They're learning about ways to protect themselves in case of an emergency. They're learning to, first of all, try to run if they can, and if they can't, to hide and shelter in place. And if they can't do that, then to fight. All this does is give one more option in that continuum to provide someone who is trained to be in the school, in those remote schools that can't afford a school resource officer, to be there to protect their children. I would urge a yes vote.
Senator Wardner.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, the carrier of the bill does make some good points, but I would like to point out that I still have a few friends in the educational community, and when you talk to the teachers, they don't want this bill. When you talk to the school administrators, they don't want this bill, and they don't want the ability to do these things. When you talk to the school board members, they don't want it. So we have a bill that nobody wants, and they plan on not using it. Therefore, I just think it's a waste of time to put it in the Century Code. So I would hope that you'd vote red.
Senator J. Lee.
Mr. President, this is too serious an issue to be sarcastic about, but my first thought is guns and children in schools. What could possibly go wrong with that? But I will not emphasize that thought. What does absolutely strike me, though, is that I have been one of many, including several people in this body, that have worked for years on behavioral health studies. What are we supposed to do? Proposals for bills and programs that we might support, because this is exactly the kind of thing that we can intervene in before we get to the point where somebody inside the building is going to be creating a situation like this. The speaker earlier from Fargo talked about the ability to make the schools more easily protected from inappropriate visitors, and the schools in my area have done that at some expense, I might add. But every school district needs to look at making secure the entrance areas to schools that can prevent an outside person coming in who shouldn't be there. But the only bill right now that we have in this entire legislature that deals with early intervention for children is 1040, which is right now in our Appropriations Committee. And it has in one section money for early intervention for children. And part of that includes a school pilot project, which in the original proposal for what was necessary in order to do this statewide was significantly more money than what is in there now. But we recognize that even a step forward is better than not making that step at all. So that there will be collaboration between the folks in the Behavioral Health Division and the folks in the Department of Public Instruction in determining how best to deal with large schools and small, rural and urban, in determining how we can assist the staff, not just the teachers, but the lunch lady and the bus drivers and the custodians, to recognize behavioral issues in children and how we can help their families, many of whom are in great distress. Everybody is not a Leave It to Beaver family, as we all know. So I think it's terribly important for us to focus our energies and our resources, financial and human, on the kinds of programs that we can put into those schools early on in those children's lives to help them get on the right path for a variety of reasons. If you're a people person only, then you ought to care about how this turns out for kids and families. If you're a numbers person only, you ought to care about the fact that the cost is going to be less to the state ultimately, because these kids aren't going to end up first in the juvenile justice programs and then in the adult criminal system. And we can do that with much smaller investments early on. I realize we're not here to vote on 1040 this second, but what I'm saying is, let's focus on getting there before we have an incident where a gun is going to be in the school for any reason. We can prevent outside intruders from coming in so much more easily than we can avoid a behavioral health issue for a youngster who's in the school in the first place. So I plan to vote no on this, but I do hope you to urge you to keep in mind the bigger picture as other things come before us before we end this legislative session.
Senator Krebsbach.
Mr. President, sometimes things come to us with good intentions, and we can get surprised when the outcome of these intentions may not be what we expect or may not even be good. That's what I think could happen with passage of this bill. There's many questions that can be brought up. Many have been answered. But the one that really comes to my mind is the question of where and who and how is this firearm going to be kept secure? And I bring that up because I know of an incident where the bad guy got the gun and it didn't end up well. You know, one educator said we now have protection and security in place in our schools, and there should be no reason for guns to be in schools at all. Another person, this wasn't an educator, I heard from a municipal judge in North Dakota, do not support this bill. Another one said, accidental tragedy can result. Mr. President, in my heart, I cannot agree with arming teachers in our schools. There has not been, as has been mentioned, one educator request that I have received to support this bill, but I have received several that have requested that I do not support this bill. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to legislate against what might happen? I say, let's leave that protection to the trained law officers.
Senator Anderson.
Well, Mr. President, I'm probably going to vote in favor of this bill on philosophical grounds. However, when we talk about local control, this is the farthest thing from local control. What we've created here is the proverbial keyhole that the camel has to go through in order for somebody to do one of these things. So, I go back to the old days when we didn't have any restrictions on whether local schools had guns or not. My principal had his rifle collection in the closet behind his office, and there were no soft targets as far as the perpetrator was concerned. The perpetrator never knew that we had all these soft targets out there, including our schools. Now, the perpetrators know that we have soft targets, and we can build all of the locks we want on the door, but if I was the perpetrator, all I have to do is take the fire extinguisher out of my car, and I can easily go through any window in the school in 2 seconds. So, we're not accomplishing a whole lot by creating soft targets, and we lock the door and pretended that we're safe now. If the perpetrator wants to get in there, he's going to get in there. So I'll vote for it on philosophical grounds, but I really don't think it accomplishes a whole lot. Thank you.
Senator Hogue.
Well, Mr. President, I think we defeated this bill last session, and this bill is a little bit watered down, but I think we should defeat it again. And my opposition to the bill, Mr. President, is I just fundamentally disagree with the carrier that somehow the inhabitants of the school are safer if we put a gun inside it. I think all of the empirical data, Mr. President, shows just the opposite. If you buy a handgun, and if you own a handgun, and the handgun is discharged to kill a human being, the most likely person to be killed by that handgun is the owner. The second most likely is an immediate family member. The way down the list is an intruder or somebody who's trying to inflict violence against the owner of the handgun. So I don't know how that raw data would change if we put that gun in the school. I think the more likely scenario, and it's my belief, that we're less safe because the gun is likely to be turned on a teacher. The gun is likely to be used by a teacher who is going through a bit of depression to make an impulsive move to take their own life. That's what all the data bears out, not the intruder. And Mr. President, I guess I would refer everyone to Nadal Hassan, who many of you may remember was the terrorist that was masquerading as an Army officer down at Fort Hood. He was in the middle of not hundreds but tens of thousands of Army soldiers who were trained and skilled in the use of weapons, handguns, long guns, crew-served weapons, you name it. And Mr. Nadal was able to kill 13 soldiers, a civilian, and he did it in the midst of an area where you would not have expected him to be able to execute mass shootings. And so all of the data doesn't support this notion that if you just put a gun somewhere in a building, that the inhabitants of that building are somehow safer. There's nothing to support that in my mind, and that's, Mr. President, why I think we should defeat the bill.
Senator Rust.
Mr. President, I represent a large rural district, and one of the schools, there are more, but one of the schools in my district is 50 miles away from the nearest law enforcement agency. This bill, as I see it, first of all, it's permissive for school boards to take somebody such as a retired law enforcement officer, what have you, give them training and have that individual in their building. Again, it's permissive. I trust school boards will make wise decisions. I've worked with a number of boards in my life, and all of them know what they want for their schools. And for some of them, they would be an absolute no, I do not want this. In some cases, it may be a situation where they would say, I think it would be a really good idea. Right now, the current laws, you're saying to every school district out there, you can't do this. This is permissive legislation to allow local school boards to make a choice if they deem necessary to have somebody equipped and trained. Vote green.
Senator Myrdal.
Mr. President, I concur with the last speaker. I live in a rural area too, and I am a school board member. Like the former speaker said, and the carrier said, this is permissive. This is not a mandate. Why would we not trust our local communities to protect our children? And by not voting yes on this, we're announcing to the world that our schools are a soft target. And I also have to disagree with some of the former speakers who talk about mental health and talk about children inside the building. We're not just talking about children that could be bad actors inside the building. We're talking about people coming from the outside and in, as happened on the East Coast at a horrific event. And all of us hope and assume this is not going to happen. But this body, we passed constitutional carry. We have passed local churches can say you can carry concealed. Why on earth would we not trust our parents and our school board members locally to protect our children. And having said that, we've been told here by law enforcement that it takes 9 to 12 minutes for a bad actor to go in and destroy an enormous amount of soft targets. In my area, I don't think there's one school that I represent that could have a law enforcement officer there within 20 to 30 minutes. And we heard some disturbing, very disturbing opponent testimony in committee that said they'd rather have us huddle down and let that happen and let law enforcement get there up to, I think it was 37 minutes. I suggest to you if that happens, a lot of concealed carry parents in our district will be on the phone with their kids and will be a militia in that school before that happens. I'd rather see a local school board decide locally how we protect our kids. And secondly, as an example, when I don't know, the rest of you campaign, when I campaign and knock on doors, if I see do not, or if I see a beware a dog on a fence, I don't know if it's a Chihuahua or a German Shepherd. In District 10 now, everybody's going to buy a German Shepherd, so I don't knock on their door. But I don't go in, because that's no longer a soft area to go in. I kind of go, well, it could be a German Shepherd, I think I'm going to go to the next house. Why on earth are we leaving our local rural schools wide open and advertising them as a soft target? I would vote yes.
Senator Robinson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, members of the Senate. We've heard several times this afternoon that we should have respect for our local school officials. I would suggest to you that the North Dakota School Boards Association, North Dakota United, and the Council of School Administrators represent those school officials. And they are unanimous in their opposition to this bill. There is no question. Like you, I've received countless emails. They go like, what are you thinking? Not in my school. You've got to be kidding. Don't vote for this bill. Mr. President, members of the Senate, 2 years ago, this bill was before this body. We so happened to have a superintendent, one, I might say, who happened to be from my district, who supported this bill 2 years ago. He sat with me on the floor and asked me what he had to do to get me to vote for this bill. Now, I've been a principal. I've been in education for many years. My wife has taught for 40 years. My mother was a teacher. My mother-in-law was a teacher. And all of them have said, this is not good policy, period. But the superintendent is trying to encourage me to vote for the bill, and I said, under no circumstances. We could sit here until next session, and I'm not going to vote for this bill. And he said, well, I really wish you would reconsider. So I posed the question to him. I said, if this bill passes, are you going to have a gun in your school? He said, most certainly. I said, are you going to carry that gun? He said, absolutely not. I said, where are you going to have it? And he said, I'll have it locked in the safe. A lot of good that's going to do. Mr. President, members of the Senate, this was a bad bill 2 years ago. It is a bad bill today. I hope we can see the writing on the wall and vote no.
Senator Kaniainen.
Mr. President, regardless of how we're going to vote today on this, I guess it's important to remember that the intent of this bill is for the small schools in small little towns, half an hour or more from any law enforcement. I'd say the majority of those who have spoken today don't have any such towns or schools in their districts, but I have a couple of them. And so again, the idea of this is to just give them the option. Of course, any city with any city police isn't going to have anything like this. They don't need it. But those that live more than half an hour away from any law enforcement, you know, if you yourself were working in a place like that, or a child was attending a school like that, maybe we'd have different thoughts about that. Of course, living in having school districts where there are resource officers that are armed, or where city police are only a couple minutes away, yeah, of course we wouldn't have guns in those schools. But again, this is for those handful of schools that are far away from any law enforcement. So I think it's important to remember that. That really hasn't been mentioned amongst all the discussion. And again, this only applies to a small handful of schools, so I'm voting yes.
Senator Oban.
Mr. President, in response to the previous speaker, I thought I would just add that if this is about small rural schools, I would think the Small Organized Schools Association would have supported it, and they actually opposed it because they too have not had any school ask them to support this. I also, in hearing local control and permissive, you know, we're all guilty at some point or another of being hypocritical in our support for local control. I've noticed that many times in our debates. I'm as guilty as anybody else, but for me this isn't as simple as local control, because kids who go to one school don't just stay in that school. They go to activities in other schools and other districts that likely have other policies, and maybe I look at this a little bit different now, but nowhere in this bill does it say that a school district has to inform its staff who is authorized to carry. It doesn't say parents deserve to know, and I guess maybe now I'm a mom, I think about things a little bit differently, but if my kid was going to school where this is authorized, I deserve to know. And while this does not say they can't know, I think it should force school districts who would choose this to inform everybody who is authorized to be this armed responder. So for that reason, upon about 1,000 others, in addition, we're tying this to South Dakota state law for training. We don't have any control over that. It specifically says in here the training is equivalent to the South Dakota School Sentinel program, and we don't have any authority over whether or not the South Dakota School Sentinel program changes. So,
Senator Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One final comment. I have rural schools in my district. I have some that are 30-some miles away from law enforcement. But, Mr. President, members of the Senate, those schools are also a long ways away from fire protection and protection from EMT services in general. So, Mr. President, members of the Senate, again, school districts don't want this. The school boards don't want it. School administrators don't want it, and our teachers don't want it. And I haven't heard an outpouring of support from parents or grandparents that want this bill. We have 3 young grandsons. 2 of them are in school. I can't think of dropping them off at the school door, thinking about what might happen that day. So, Mr. President, members of the Senate, I would hope we vote red.
Senator Wanzik.
Mr. President, I have a question. I would say probably of the carrier or anybody who would know.
Say your question.
And my question is truly a sincere one. I don't know. And if it was said, I apologize, I missed it. But do the schools, larger schools that can afford their own resource or law resource enforcement person, are they allowed to carry a weapon or a gun? And if they are, don't we already have guns in school then?
Senator D. Larson.
Mr. President, yes, the school resource officers carry their sidearms with them into the schools every day. I worked with the school resource officers in my job that I retired from a couple of years ago, and every time they go anywhere, that's part of their uniform, and they always carry it. And frankly, right in the very beginning, there were a few people that went, oh, there's a gun. But now, it's just kind of every day. They don't really even think about it. It is part of the police uniform, and people are used to it. I do want to, if I could continue, Mr. President, to clarify something that was mentioned earlier by the senator from District 38. He mentioned about the person in the school may have mental health issues. If you look at the bill on page 2 under F, one of the requirements is that they have a mental health evaluation by a qualified mental health provider who certifies the individual is capable of performing the duties of a first responder. Additionally, when he referred to the terrible killings at Fort Hood, those other soldiers were not allowed to be armed. I don't think he would have been able to kill as many if they had been.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, questions on the final passage of House Bill 1310. Secretary will open the key. Each senator will record his or her vote. Have all the senators voted? Does any senator wish to change their vote? Secretary will close the key and take the tally. The final tally on House Bill 1310 reveals 18 ayes, 27 nays, 2 absent not voting. The bill is lost. Senate will be on the 12th order.